Hello. Today I wanted to talk about how you can identify and give you some options for fixing segregation of duties and licensing issues in D365F&O. I wanted to look at two separate ways. One is to look at the native features that D365F&O offer out of the box, and then also look at what a solution like Fastpath gives you for those areas as well. So before we get started, a few things that I wanted to just keep in mind while we're going through this. One is that the solutions I'm going to provide are just some of the potential fixes, right? This is not a complete list of everything that you could potentially do to remediate or to address those issues. None of the information provided is audit advice in any way. This is presented as purely educational on how you could potentially go and fix this, on different options for addressing those. And then when we're talking about modifying security as we get into these solutions, it's always best practice to clone your security layer first and then make your changes. As I go through this, I may make changes to the out-of-the-box security just for sake of time, but it's always best practice to clone those and then to make your changes there. So I've set up two different scenarios, one for segregation duties and one for licensing, and I want to show, kind of do a comparison from an F&O and then a Fastpath perspective. So if we look at segregation duties, the scenario that I set up here is to create an SOD risk rule in F&O as well as Fastpath that would look at the being able to separate the creation of vendors and then vendor payments. In both cases, the SARA user is assigned permissions that violate this rule. So what can we do to actually remediate this issue that this user has? So if we look at natively within D365 first, we can see first I had to go in and actually set this rule up, right? This was a rule that did not exist in the system beforehand. I actually had to go and set this up. One other thing here is that the segregation duties within F&O is done at the duty level. So I had to go in and actually find the maintained vendor and the maintained vendor payments duties, put those into conflict with each other, give a severity, a risk, and then a mitigation if I wanted to. So once I set this up, then I have the ability to actually go and run a review of my current user role assignments to see where there are violations. So just for sake of this, you can find this at System Administration under Segregation Duties. The rules are actually set up under Segregation Duties rules. And then you verify compliance of user role assignments, right? So I don't know if I can pull those back up here. Once you do that, then the system will go out and look to see if there are any users assigned to those roles that have access to both those duties, and we'll show those to you here. So you can see there are two different entries here because this user has two different ways that she's getting access to this. So if we look at the top example here, we can see that because this user is assigned the purchasing agent and the accounts payable payments clerk role, you can see this is actually a cross-role conflict. One of the roles is giving her access to one side of the conflict, another role is giving her access to the other side of the conflict. All right, so what can we do to actually look at remediating this based on the information we're provided here, right? Because this only goes down to the duty level, our options are somewhat limited in the sense that we can either go in and remove one or more of the roles from this user, right? We could go in and remove the purchasing agent role or the accounts payable clerk role from this user. Or we could go in and actually modify the purchasing agent role to no longer contain the maintain vendor master duty, or go into the accounts payable clerk role and remove the maintain vendor payments duty, right? So those are really our two options when we're actually going and looking at this. If we actually wanted to go in and perform those, right? If we went to the user page here, we could go to the SARA user. This user has a number of different roles assigned to her, right? And we could go through and actually find those roles, the accounts payable payment clerk role, and remove it, or the purchasing agent role, right, and remove it, right? Those would be the two that we could potentially remove. We'll only have to remove one or the other. We could potentially remove both. But obviously that's a fairly heavy-handed way to go about removing this, right? They're going to lose a lot of access by removing those roles. So the next option would be to actually go in and look at modifying either one or both of the roles so they no longer have access to those duties. So if we wanted to go to the purchasing agent role, first and foremost, we can go and look at the duties that this particular role is assigned, and then go down to find that maintain vendor master duty, right? And we could actually look at removing that reference from that particular role, right? So, again, because we only get down to the duty level, right, the vendor master role has a number of different privileges and accesses underneath it. We would have to remove the entire duty to actually remediate that conflict. And that's just because of the way that F&O actually handles segregation duties conflicts. Now, if we go and look to see what a tool like Fastpath allows you to do, we have the ability to go to and actually look to see, because Fastpath goes down to the object level when we're looking at our segregation duties risks, we have a lot of more different options that we can perform to actually remediate this risk. One thing to note here, first off, is that we do have an out-of-the-box rule set that contains a rule that's would actually be able to capture this particular scenario where a user would be able to maintain your vendor payments and maintain the vendor master. So you don't have to actually go and set that up. That's already out of the box. So when you actually run this report here, right, we're not only just going to show you the role and the duty that's actually breaking that or violating that rule. We're actually going to go down to the object level to actually show you what is causing this particular risk in this case. And so we can actually go down to see, in this case, the privilege and the secureable object or security object here that's actually allowing you to perform this particular task. So at this point then, right, you could go in and not only remove the role from the user or the duties from the role, you could look at removing the duties from the privilege, or actually going down to the object level and modifying what that particular privilege allows you to do. So in this case, right, there's only two accesses that actually allow you to maintain that vendor payment side. And so we could actually go in to see, does this user actually need those particular accesses, or could we remove those particular accesses from this user and actually then remediate the conflict, because she would only then have access to one side of the risk and not both sides, right? So there's, because of the additional level of detail on the Fastpath side, right, we're able to get a little bit deeper and allow you to have many other options from that regard. Jumping back in, so that's from the segregation and duties perspective. If we go down to our licensing scenario that I set up, one of the things that I did in this case was I created a custom role called the FP vendor role, which is assigned a single duty in this case that is requiring an operations level license, right? So, and then I assigned that particular role to the April user. And so now the question is first off, how can we see what licenses this user is required to have, and are there ways that we could potentially lower that user's access and therefore lower the license requirements for this user? So now if we jump into the F&O side, we can actually go to our license report from a user license perspective at system administration, inquiries, license, and then user license counts. So when I ran this report for the April user, you can see here that she's required to have an operations level license because she's assigned that FP vendor role, right? And so what we can then do, because this is a single role, we could potentially go to something like security configuration and try to figure out what this, FP vendor role is assigned to, see about looking at removing those licenses. But if this user is assigned 20 roles, right, and we're trying to figure out what is actually causing her to be assigned that particular license, right, that becomes a much more manual process. So at this point, right, the only real option we have to remediate this is to either remove this particular role from the user from the FP vendor role, or from the April user, or we could potentially start doing that manual process of going role by role to see what we could potentially remove. One other report that we have within F&O from a license perspective is that user license estimator report, which again can be found slightly further down in the license reports area. It's still in security administration here. And this is going to then be able to show us the license SKU requirements. And because this is a custom role that I created, the system doesn't know which license this user needs to be assigned. It knows that it needs to be assigned an operations level license, but it doesn't know which license SKU. So it's basically putting this user on this report but not filling in any of the bubbles here for that. So what can we potentially do to look at remediating this, right? So if you look at, compare that to what like a Fastpath report offers, the first and foremost from a user license perspective, right, we're going to very quickly be able to come in and look at our user and say, yep, she requires an operations level license. We can see the license SKU information, so we can actually look to see based on the privileges this user is assigned, this user needs to be assigned either a finance or SDM license currently. But one of the big things is that we show the entry point level for, or the number of entry points at each license level for this user. So in this case, we can see there's 3 accesses at the operations level license. So this, first off, gives us a viewpoint to actually identify that this is a potential scenario that we could remediate, right? Because, you know, if a user, for example, like the Alicia user has 1,800 entry points at the operations level, that's going to be a much tougher user to try to bring down than this April user that only has 3 entries at that operations level, right? Because if we can remove those 3 accesses, right, we could have this user only require an activity license, and therefore, you know, have this user drop down from a license type. So the second report then is going to, well, I need the detailed information behind this, right? I actually need to be able to see the role, duty, privilege information to actually show me this. And so that's where you can come into our detailed reports to actually show you the role, duty, and privilege information to get down to what objects are actually being, you know, assigned here or causing this particular role to have this license or require this license. So at this point then, right, you have the option of either going in and looking to see, okay, do I want to remove this duty from the role, the privileges from the duty, or do I want to look at actually removing the objects from the privileges, or in one key piece here, do I want to, because these are at the access type level of delete, is there an opportunity for me to go down from a delete to a read and have this require lower level license, right? And so I can actually review that within Fastpath as well. I can actually go in to see, we have a security objects report that actually shows the license requirements for those objects. And because if we look here, we can see the view user license for each of these is set at team member, while the maintain is set at operations. So that means that if the user has read access to those objects, it only requires a team member license. So if I were to just lower the level of access from a delete to a read, this would take this down from an operations to a team member. So if I wanted to go back into F&O and actually look to see the options that I could potentially do here, I could go to my security configuration page, look at for that FP vendor role, and start working my way down, right? I have the option here, of course. Obviously, there's only one duty assigned, but I could remove the duty from the role. I have the ability to look at the privileges here and then use my Fastpath report or the security configuration report from Microsoft to actually determine the privileges that were causing that particular object to, or the role to require that level of license. So for example, the logistics, you know, this would be one of the actual privileges that was causing the issue, right? I could remove the entire privilege from this, again, using the remove references. Or I could go down to the display menu items and actually look to see, in this case, this privilege only has one object. And I know if I come in here, this object is currently assigned full control. I know from my Fastpath reports that if I only assigned read permission to this, right, and actually set this to be unset instead of grant for the other 3, that this particular access would go from requiring an operations level license down to a team member license, right? So I could do that exact same process going through this as well. So I hope going through those different scenarios was helpful, looking at things from a segregation duties and a licensing perspective to see where, first off, how you can identify the issues that you do have, and secondly, what you can do to potentially fix those issues, both from a native Dynamics 365 F&O perspective as well as a Fastpath perspective. Thank you for listening.